Hi everyone, welcome back. This is video 5 of the Read Aloud video series for the new dark paranormal fantasy book, The Violet Curse. For disclaimers and extra information, view the first video in the series. You can find the rest of the videos for this book on my YouTube channel, 7 Bloodfire Art and Story. For more information about the books and the author, visit 7bloodfire.com and follow me on social media under the handle 7bloodfire. In the previous video, we enjoyed Chapter 2, which was titled Killer. The map will remain the same as with Chapter 2. The yellow highlight shows the forest outside of Crow Post as a reminder. Viewer discretion is still a little bit advised. This chapter will split points of view between Robert and Reed Ivan. Chapter 3, Tracks. The chestnut horses bucked wildly as the heat from the burning carriage swept across the reins and licked at their flanks. The assembly took off behind them as Reed and his men pursued it. One of the wheels broke over a rocky patch, and the body of the wooden beast tilted as the wheel flew apart and pieces careered into the trees. The axle dragged behind the flaming vessel, forming a deep fissure that Robert knew might make their own horses falter. Yet there were no screams from inside, no cries, just flames and the sloshing of mud and water and hoofbeats and the distraught screeches of the horses. The men shouted wildly as they pursued the runaway carriage. Robert was the one who saw the body upon the ground where the passenger side wheels had pressed it deeply into the mud. He dismounted as others chased the flaming carriage, and a sick dread began to pool low in his belly as his horse began to back away uneasily. His muscles corded with tension as he knelt by the body he recognized as Davos, the enforcer that Black Temple had sent to them, the one who had said he would stay behind with Mr. and Mrs. Ivan. "Reed!" he called. Reed looked over his shoulder as his dark horse cantered in a circle. "What is it, Robert?" Reed replied. His glowing, torchlit gaze flicked down, and his jaw ticked violently. Skeletal shadows rolled across his features as he shook his head angrily. "Is that Davos? Is he dead?" he demanded, and he held the torch aloft as he drove his horse closer and peered down at the dead man as Robert rolled him over. The face was covered in mud, but the features were unmistakable. His black hair was tied at the back at the nape of his neck, and his half-open gray-green eyes were lifeless and dull. He had one missing canine between a wide-open hair-lip and 2 snaggle teeth, one of which was broken at an angle, the other of which was malformed. It was certainly Davos, as few men were uglier. "He's been murdered," said Robert. "A right worthless dagger still broken off in him. The blood is still hot." Reed drew a breath and unholstered his gun with a curse. "We'll come back for him. Look for the tracks and be quick about it. The killer can't have gone far. I want him alive. If there's more than one man, do not engage them. Radio me immediately if you find my parents and Tehran are being held hostage." His horse dipped her head as she eyed the corpse and pranced cautiously closer, her hooves rising high out of the mud and steam coming out of her nostrils in mighty puffs. No doubt the intelligent animal could smell the blood. She had probably heard the wolves, too. But Reed jerked the reins and kicked his heels against the beast's sides. "Ha!" he hissed. "Moved!" Robert let Davos's body sink back into the mud, and he pressed his fingers to the dead man's eyelids to close them. He offered a quick prayer as he forced the handle of his own torch deeply back into the mud so it could stand unaided. "I'm sorry we were not here in time to prevent this tragedy, my friend." With his thumb, he drew a circle upon Davos's rigid brow to represent his life having come to its end. "Every circle begins anew," he said. "And so your death begins your next life." Then he followed that symbol with a vertical line from the forehead to the bridge of the nose to offer guidance. "Soggiorno," the open door. "The brightest star, so you may find your way." Robert cursed when he heard another barking growl. The wolves were getting closer. They smelled the blood, surely. Robert snatched his torch and began searching the mud for clues. Before him, Among the darkest drifting shadows in the brush, a pair of golden eyes blinked. The sound that came from the beast's belly was feral and hungry and unforgiving. Robert backed away, glancing desperately to either side of himself as the huge creature eyed the flames he held and continued to creep forward into the light. The wolf was all black, and the gentle rain dripped from its fur in muddy, oily streams. Its upper lip quivered as Robert stepped away quietly, and its tongue lashed out as the scent of the fresh body beckoned to it. The wolf's ears pricked as it crept closer, and the lean animal slunk closer to the ground, its body quivering as it readied itself to spring upon him should he move suddenly. It did not attack him as he retreated slowly, but its eyes never left him or the torch in his hand. Then 2 more pairs of gold and gray eyes flickered to life in the darkness, both to either side of the first. The growling became a constant warning, one rolling over another and rolling over another. But they did not approach for the bright, flickering threat that Robert held between them and him. They did not like the fire. But they did not attack him as he backed away. Instead, they continued to lock eyes with him as they bowed their heads and began to rend the body of his dead comrade. He fled from them, panic-stricken, yet grateful. When the wolves were far behind him, it took his experienced eyes merely a moment before he saw more stirrings upon the ground. Even in his hurry, he saw clearly the prints left in the muddier patches, where even a blind novice would have been able to follow the tracks. There were several deep, bare prints that were already filling with the evening's drenching downpour, and he followed them quickly as the wolves and their meal fell behind. Robert noticed from the hurried prints in the muck that Davos's killer hadn't made an effort to be more cautious. Either the murderer hadn't planned on their unexpected arrival, or the wolves had chased him off. The clues pointed to the former. The scene was too fresh to allow for anything else. No shoes. The startling detail struck Robert as odd, as his temple throbbed with fear and anger. He tried to concentrate on the tracks, but it was difficult to do so when he could still hear the bones in Davos's corpse crunching between teeth, when he could hear the sickening sound of flesh being torn. No shoes. It was dangerous and painful to navigate the forest barefoot at night, although it was quieter than certain footwear. The prints also came from a thin person, likely a man judging from the size and depth of each impression. Maybe a younger man, due to the dexterous twisting and quick footwork the prints showed. Robert was startled by a deadfall which crashed noisily a mere few feet away. Nothing stood where the sound had occurred, and nothing else stirred there. Below him, the prints indicated the murderer was not only barefoot, but also traveling light. It meant it would be more difficult to catch the man. He then thought of the weapon he had pulled from Davos's corpse and considered details it may impart of its last wielder. The blade and its handle had no longer been in one piece, but several. The blade had been badly cared for, as if to hint the killer was inexperienced and ill-prepared, an encounter gone wrong. Yet the strike had been one of precision. Only a well-practiced, knowing hand would have angled that blade right to have managed that kill. The man he was chasing was very dangerous, he concluded. Robert's neck prickled as he prayed those wolves would not follow him, and he shrank from every unusual noise about him as he pondered what sort of man would have dared murder Davos and set fire to the coach. A servant of one of the criminal lords who had taken slaves, possibly? Mr. and Mrs. Ivan were old, which would have been an unfavorable discovery for that line of work. And if that were the case, why attack a Black Temple wagon for slaves? It didn't make sense to try to attack such a prominent, dangerous target when many small villages and holds were relatively unprotected and offered easy prey. Robert concluded that the killer had not attacked the wagon for slaves. The man had been after information, loot, or revenge, or he had been hired for another purpose. He hadn't been a wolfman either, because it was highly implausible a wolfman would use a metal blade, and because it was rare for wolfmen to attack anyone from Black Temple. Even the common folk, often called the weary-worn by Black Temple doctors and enforcers, rebuked those who crossed Black Temple. Most of the weary-worn welcomed the temple's agents, its doctors, its aid. To attack anyone from Black Temple was to reject the whole medical guild as well as all that it stood for. Without Black Temple's doctors, various diseases destroyed entire communities and cities without relief or relent. To oppose Black Temple was to condemn entire villages and posts and towns to death. And the coaches very rarely carried commodities or gold the way merchants did. Only coded information could have been valuable, and that would have been sealed in a small wooden box with a silver feather engraved upon it. Forcing the box open without having the proper knowledge on how to operate its tricky mechanisms would destroy the contents therein. It was a well-known fact the temple did not hide in order to deter thefts. Whatever this was, it was a desperate move, though Robert could not discern why or by whom. There was nothing to be taken from this coach or these innocent people but for a small handful of gold. Not even their clothes were to be desired, and all of that was intentional. It was a deterrent to prevent greedy thieves and desperate men alike from being tempted. Robert put his questions out of his mind to focus entirely on catching the murderer. The trail led deep into the trees. He kept his knife handy in case any of the wolves were following him. In places, the bastard's clues altogether vanished, but Robert was no novice. He knew how to find the trail when it seemed to fade away. The general direction led toward a grazing field a couple of miles from his current location, which meant the bastard had a horse waiting for him there, and he likely had friends there too. Robert cursed and whistled for his mare. Bane had followed behind him a good distance. She had remained quiet, nervous the wolves were prowling. The mare's ears pricked at his call, and one more sharp, bird-like whistle had the sweet creature trotting nearer. She was still quite fidgety, and when his palm touched her cheek or touched her neck, her flesh quivered beneath his hand. Robert doused the torch and then grabbed at the saddle's pommel and hoisted himself onto Bane's back. He pulled out a walkie and turned it on. He prayed the others weren't out of range. "Reed, can you hear me?" For a moment, there was nothing. He scanned the darkness cast from the trees leaning over him, and he watched for the trails parting the long grasses in the fields beyond. He knew he might have to wait before one of the other men dispatched a walkie to Reed, so he remained alert as he waited. His mare shuddered. "Scout to range, Commander." "What have you found?" Reed asked from the other end. He sounded breathless, as though he was still riding hard. There was a brief moment when Robert could hear the other men in Reed's company shouting. They were still chasing down the carriage. "I've got a solid lead, Commander. If you lot don't hurry my way, we won't catch him for days. He's heading back to the knoll. He's wasted no time getting there, either." "He has a horse," Reed swore. "He knows where that wild graze is." "Affirmative," Robert agreed. "He knows the area well. It isn't likely he found that spot by accident. You'd be mad to think there's a graze there otherwise, surrounded by too much rock and wild forest." "We're about out of range, Robert. Just circle back and wait for us, and we'll follow you and catch this bastard." "Reed, unless he has others waiting on him there, he's alone," Robert said regretfully. "There are no other prints." For a long moment there was no reply. He knew that Reed had heard him. He knew that Reed understood what it might mean. "I'll keep looking for more prints if you want me to. Perhaps I missed them. The wolves got to Davos just after you left. Perhaps I didn't see anything else." "You never miss a thing," Reed sighed. "Wolves or no. Get back and see if you can find any trace of my parents or of Taran. Be careful of the pack, though. I don't want to come back and find you dead and your horse lame." Robert nodded, his mouth downturned. "All right. Going dark." "Affirmative." With that, Robert turned down his walkie and wheeled his mare about in a half circle. "Come, Bane." His tongue clicked and the fine creature's ears pricked. The soft sound rumbled in her throat, and he scratched her mane fondly. "Come on, girl, back we go. You'll get some fine treats when we're back at camp for all this fine work you've done." Reed jumped from his horse and ran toward the carriage, where it lay crumpled in a ruined heap against the boulders. His heart was in his throat. Thomas was leaning into the door, his hand clutching at the frame to keep himself from falling in, where the fire flared hottest. His dark blue scarf was wrapped tightly about his nose and his mouth as he fought to break away the planks that had blocked the door in the wreckage. He couldn't grab onto the burning planks because they were far too hot to do so. He couldn't wedge his blade between them to pry them apart either. He had already tried, and it had done no good. "Commander, don't!" cried Baron Westfall as the man darted in front of him. Reed was wide-eyed and quaking when Baron took his shoulders to push him back. "Let me go!" Reed barked as the other men stepped forward to prevent him from getting any closer to the flaming carriage. "My parents!" he shouted. "I have to know what he's done." Thomas shrank away as something combustible inside the carriage exploded. It wasn't a substantial explosion, but there was enough force in it to throw Thomas back. He fell into the mud when he lost his grip on the door, and he struggled to roll over, his chest heaving. But he made no move to get up, to try to get into the carriage again. He pulled a couple of pieces of sizzling glass from his cheek. The lantern oil. That's what had exploded. The canisters of oil that usually remained beneath the seats with the spare lanterns. Reed felt his own face twist with a savage expression when Thomas's shoulders bowed. Thomas pulled the scarf away and looked up at him, his eyes bleary, sorrowful, knowing. "No," Reed croaked. His throat had gone dry, and a dangerous tremor ran through him. He continued to shake his head as the truth struck the rest of them, and they let go of him for pity. His feet brought him nearer the fire until Thomas rose and stood before him. Thomas held up his hands and pleaded with him. "You don't want to see them," Thomas said. The smoke had transformed his voice into a hoarse, grating whisper. "Reed, I'm so sorry." Reed looked at his friend, yet he didn't quite see him. His face blurred in and out of focus. Reed's eyes stung as he tried to blink away the smoke and the ash. He pushed past his friend and bent over the carriage's frame, and he began to claw at the boards. The charred surface of the wood was blackened, and red embers glowed hot in the exposed crevices. Then he felt and heard the crack, and cinders sparked in his face as planks broke entirely. The heat blistered his skin and singed his eyebrows and his hair. Another board he grabbed. He could smell sizzling flesh. "Commander!" snapped Thomas. He ignored Thomas and continued to pry at the burning timbers until the last one he held groaned and creaked but refused to break. Thomas hissed and then called to the men, "Help us, you dim-witted bastards, before he loses the use of his hands." Thomas wrapped his own hands and climbed onto the carriage, his scarf back in place. He gripped another part of the bench Reed was trying to pry free, and then Baron and Arnold and Reagan began to help, and Tim Aaron and Nathan Heinrich joined them too. Only Zachary remained behind. He held the reins of the two freed chestnut horses, both of whom sported minor burns and scorched hair. The mare limped lightly and snorted in complaint, but Zachary continued to calm her as he kept her from looking at the fire. The bodies inside the carriage were burned badly. Nathan retched at the putrid smell of the still sizzling flesh when they hauled the old couple from the wreckage. All the men stood silently as Reed knelt by his mother and his father, his burned hands hovering above first his father's corpse, then his mother's. His hands shook violently, but he couldn't bring himself to touch either of them. His breath came in harsh, grating wheezes. He opened his mouth, but nothing left his lips as he stared down at them and kept shaking his head in dejected, wrenching despair. His mother's neck had been broken, and his father's throat had been slit wide open. "Reed, the killer is still within our reach. Robert has his tracks, but we're running out of time. At the mention of the killer, the agony Reed felt became a plume of explosive hatred. Reed nodded silently and stood, his gaze never leaving his parents' blackened bodies. "My father's ring is missing," he said evenly, and he stared hard at the bony appendage where a strip of uncharred flesh shone brightly in the firelight. Where his father had worn the ring remained a pale, wrinkled stripe. The sun had not darkened the skin there in many years because his father had never taken the ring off, never once. The ring was gone because it had been stolen. The orange and yellow glow of the flames sparked brightly, and he looked up at Thomas and Baron. "Bring my horse. We have a murderer to hunt." "You can't kill him," Thomas warned. "This is Black Temple's coach. The Regency will deal with him accordingly." "I know what Black Temple's Regency will do, Thomas," Reed snarled. "Until then, he's mine. I'll not break the law, much anyway. This may have been Black Temple's coach, but those were my parents. If I were you, I'd worry more about what my little brother does to him when he finds out what has happened to our mother and our father." Baron shook his head. "It would be wiser to send the killer to Black Temple before you tell John. That man has a perturbed temper waiting to explode. Too much like your father, he is. More people are like to die getting in the way of stopping him, friend or foe, or even you." "Doesn't matter what John does with him," Reed spat. "Mount up and run this bastard down." When he turned from his parents' bodies, he saw Thomas exchange a fearful glance with Baron. "I fear I might pity the killer for what the range commander will do to them," said Thomas, who then turned to the other men as Reed snatched up his horse's tethers with a hand that shook. "Best get after him before we can't stop him, before he crosses the line that cannot be uncrossed. He's too good a leader to lose over a murderer." "What about Tayerin?" Zachary asked. "Likely dead too. We'll find him after we get this killer. Unless you want to volunteer and stay behind to search and battle wolves for the carcass." "If it's okay, I would like to try to find him. It would be a dishonor unto him not to try. If he's dead, someone should at least offer him the proper prayer. If he's alive, he may need help." "Be my guest," said Thomas. "But remember protocol and keep the channel clear. And don't forget those damned wolves. And do not let your guard down. I don't want to come back and find another body." Reed was the first to mount and the first to disappear into the night. He left his torch lying in the mud where he had dropped it. That's the end of chapter 3. I hope you enjoy it. Give me comments below. I would love to know what you think. And I've got more details. You can find this on Amazon. I've got more details on my website at 7bloodfire.com. So I would love, love, love to read the next chapter, which is coming soon. So periodically through Twitter and Instagram, I will be doing free signed book and signed art print giveaways for fans in the United States. The art is created by yours truly, same as the book itself. To enter the first giveaway, follow me and enter the hashtag TVC1 giveaway, and that's a number 1. My social media handle is 7bloodfire. The first winners will be decided mid-April of 2021, at which time I will make the announcement on my website. Contest details will also be noted on 7bloodfire.com. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up and share it on social media so our Leviathans family can get bigger. Yay! Thank you so much, guys.